I now call on Ms. Jacinta David, who is the Chief Cultural Officer acting at the Division of Culture, to give a few remarks.
Thank you, Kimoon. His Excellency the President of Dominica, Mr. Charles Savre and Mrs. Savre, His Lordship, Bishop Gabriel Malza, Bishop of Roseau, Director of UE Open Campus Dominica, Dr. Francis Savre, Justice Dr. Irving Andre, Superior Court of Justice, Ontario, Canada, members of the Leblanc family, Ms. Kimon Joseph, Officer in Charge, UE Open Campus Dominica, Mrs. Natasha Gervier, President, UE Open Campus Guild of Students, Dominica Chapter, other distinguished invited guests, the media, ladies and gentlemen, Boswe epi bienvenue. We are here this evening for the third annual Edward Oliver Leblanc Distinguished Lecture Series. Pour moi, ça c'est vraiment un plaisir. This evening, the theme is E.O. Leblanc, a rendezvous with history. The Cultural Division is pleased to partner with UE on this initiative over the past 3 years. We are contented because the emphasis of the E.O. Leblanc Distinguished Lecture Series is on the preservation and the development of the rich cultural heritage of Dominica and the Caribbean region. This public lecture series seeks to provide a forum for scholars to share their research with members of the public and to also encourage society's engagement in meaningful discussions on socio-political issues. We are particularly happy that Dr. Irving Andre was able to find some time within his busy schedule to share his thoughts and perspectives on the man E.O. Leblanc and his contribution to the development process here in Dominica. Mr. Leblanc was an eminent politician who made an indelible mark on the political landscape in Dominica. He ushered in important political changes in Dominica. E.O. Leblanc, however, was also a cultural activist, promoting the Creole language and culture. It's coincidental that today is International Creole Day, Journée Creole Internationale, and E.O. Leblanc passed away on Creole Day, October 29, 2004. Tomorrow marks the 10th anniversary of his physical death, for his spirit lives on indeed. It was he who established Dominica's National Day and the National Day festivities and cultural competitions which continue to this day. We at the Cultural Division are always grateful for this and applaud him for his foresight and vision. The E.O. Leblanc Trophy instituted by his family is presented annually to a group, school, or individual who has been promoting cultural development in Dominica. The Cultural Division has on display photographs of Mr. Leblanc at the Old Mill Museum. The division also published a book of photographs entitled Dominica Heritage Volume 1, which includes all photographs of Mr. Leblanc. In this way, we seek to keep the memory of Mr. Leblanc alive. It is very important to research, document, and highlight the work of E.O. Leblanc and other national heroes and figures, and our nation builders, The life and work of Mr. Leblanc needs to be promoted in schools. Efforts such as these and efforts of individuals such as Dr. Andre are helpful in this regard. The lecture this evening will contribute to this as well. This event forms part of the National Calendar of Events for Independence. This year, we celebrate the 36th anniversary of independence under the theme, Our Nation, Our Responsibility. Mr. E.O. Leblanc embodied this ethos and gave a great deal of his life to this nation. Under his leadership, Dominica made great advances in culture, health, education, physical infrastructure, economy, and social relations. He was committed to help the poor and underprivileged and sought to curtail discrimination and abuse by the ruling class. We all look forward to hearing the perspectives of Dr. Andre and to the discussion which will follow. Let me thank UWI for partnering with the Division of Culture in this exercise. Thanks also to the media houses for your presence. To you, the audience, here present, and those listening via radio, I thank you as well. I offer best wishes for an inspiring evening. I thank you all.
Dr. Irving Andre was born in Curacao. He spent his formative years in Dominica and attended the Portsmouth Government School, the Dominica Grammar School, and the Sixth Form College. Justice Andre studied at the UWI Mona, where he read English, history, and philosophy, and in 1981 graduated with first-class honors and a gold medal for the best overall performance in the university's Faculty of Arts. He attended the Osgood Hall Law School at York University in Canada and graduated with academic prizes in labor and immigration law. One of these essays on the Caribbean Agricultural Workers Program in Canada was published in the 1990 edition of Osgood Hall Law Journal and has been referred to in a number of cases, including one in the Supreme Court of Canada. He was called to the bar in Ontario in 1990. Justice Andre later worked as a prosecutor for the Ontario Ministry of Labour, an assistant Crown Attorney in Brampton, a criminal defense lawyer, and vice president of the Ontario License Appeal Tribunal. In 2002, he was appointed as judge in the Ontario Court of Justice, where he presided as a local administrative judge in the region of Peel until 2012. Justice Andre earned a master's degree in law in 2006 and a doctorate in law in 2010, and became the first judge in the Ontario Court of Justice to hold a doctorate degree in law. In 2012, Justice Andre was appointed to the Supreme Court of Justice, where he currently presides. He has served as the president of the United Achievers Club of Brampton and the Cicero Cultural Club of Brampton. He has been a board member of the former Peel Memorial Hospital, the John Howard Society, and United Achievers Nonprofit Housing Corporation. He co-founded a group called The Rescue, which caters to the needs of youth at risk, and for many years co-organized an annual event called the Youthquake, in which professionals from all walks of life met for one day and shared their experiences with minority students. Justice Andre has received numerous community awards, including the Dominican of Distinction Award, the Black History Makers Award, the YMCA Angel Award, the African Canadian Achievement Award, the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Justice Andre has also written a number of books, including biographies of Honorable Franklin Barron, Dominica's first Chief Minister, Honorable Edward Oliver Leblanc, Dominica's first Premier, Dr. Desmond McIntyre, Dominica's first surgeon, business pioneers Mr. Elias Nassif and Mr. Albert Cavendish Shillingford, and the late Charles Maynard. He also co-authored a book with Washington-based attorney Gabriel Christian on the services and sacrifices of the British West India military. Justice Andre and his wife Kathy have been married for 30 years, and they have two daughters, Melissa and Kathy. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Justice Dr. Irving Andre, presenting E.O. Leblanc, A Rendezvous with History.
Good evening, and I thank you for this warm welcome. It is the happy hour with a difference tonight. Distinguished guests His Excellency the President, Mr. Charles Savre and Mrs. Savre, His Lordship the Bishop, Dr. Severin, the political leader of the United Workers' Party, government officials, the distinguished members of the Leblanc family, one of whom I haven't seen for 25 years, members of the cultural division, and Dominicans. Obviously, I'm very happy to be here, and I thank the university for asking me to be here. It's a commitment to free expression. It's a commitment to the ventilation of ideas that I have been asked to be here. Because let's face it, my ideas may not necessarily coincide with your ideas, but that is the purpose of why we're here. I cannot reward you for your presence. I'm sorry about that. I cannot offer you the pulsating songs of a belly drum or the rhythmic beauty of poetry, or the dynamic movement of quadrille, the humor of conte, or the beauty of wob duet. The writing of Dominica's history is not a plantation to which I hold a certificate of title, or one in which I have erected a sign saying, "No trespassers." I do not claim to hold a monopoly over the interpretation of Dominica's history. Neither do I believe that I have been anointed to chronicle the island's history. There are those who came before me and those who will come after me to add their own voices to the burgeoning literature of Dominica. All I can therefore offer you are a few words plucked from the landscape of my mind, filtered by my own bias and my reflection over time. I salute the writers who have had occasion to document Dominica's history. I salute persons such as Father Jolly, Dr. Honeychurch, Mr. Lazar, Mr. and Mrs. Levy, Paula Patulu, Dr. Polidor, Ian Jackson, and others. I also salute a special group of writers, sports commentators and columnists. I salute Mr. Philip Arlene, who's been writing since 1968, Mr. Reginald Havis Shillingford, who has been writing since the mid-50s, and that is not a reflection of his age. I also salute Mr. Ozzie Lewis, who is not with us. I salute others who've had occasion to explore with us what is so essential in our history. I've had occasion to recently do some research about Dominica's cricket, and I am simply amazed at the perspicacity, at the dedication of these men who, without fanfare and commendation, and sometimes without compensation, have made it their business to document what is so important in our sporting history. I've been asked to give this address presumably because of my biography of Mr. Leblanc, which I wrote about a decade ago. I am fortunate to have authored or co-authored about 18 books. I have personally financed the publication of 14 or 15 of these books. Allow me at this juncture to publicly thank the 3 individuals who financially contributed to the publication of those 3 books. Let me also thank the hundreds of persons I have interviewed over the past 2 decades, the wonderful staff of the archives, and all those who have assisted me in so many ways. I also thank all the relatives, the friends, the colleagues, the subjects, the families of subjects of those biographies, all of whom have contributed generously with information over the past 2 decades. Now, there is no mystery why I've expended time, energy, and effort to write the biographies I have written. Look no further than the following lines in Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Quote, "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air." Or read the following lines of Derek Walcott in his classic poem Homeros, chapter 28, verse 3, quote, "Where, in which stones of the abbey, are incised our names? Who defines our delight? Within whose palatable vault will echo the saints' litany of our island people? Who will teach us a history of which 2 are capable?" And if you need a little more prosaic justification for my writings, turn the pages of the Dominica Hansard of October 26, 1967, page 14, and read the following profound lines of Edward Oliver Leblanc. Quote, "The sum total of individual biographies constitute the history of a nation, and it is by these little recognitions of certain individuals that we can teach the Dominican of today and posterity what it means to be living in a country." And so we must write objectively about slavery, the Kalinago people, Edward Oliver, Leblanc, Frank Barron, Dr. McIntyre, Elias Nassif, Charles Maiden, and Albert Cavendish Shillingford, just as we write about Jean Rees, Elmer Napier, and Elrose and Company Limited. We must write, and we will write, about our lost sporting heroes, particularly those who have fallen into the crevasses of history. Men like Merrill Anthony, the legendary fast bowler from Newtown, Alec Reed, the brilliant wicketkeeper from Pottersville who was robbed in the 50s of a place on the West Indies cricket team, and Val Felix, the extraordinarily gifted cricket captain of the 50s, who only 2 weeks ago was inducted into the Ryerson University Hall of Fame for his prowess on the soccer field. We must write about Bishop Bowers, Cardinal Felix, and yes, Father Clement Jolly. We must write about C.E.A. Rawle, Cozy Harris, Ashton Piper, and Telford Judges. We must write because we have reached a stage in our maturity, I assume, where we are not consumed by self-hatred, paternalism, condescension, or insecurity about the achievements of others. We must write because of our belief that we too, in the words of Derek Walcott, are worthy of occupying a place in the Abbey. My responsibility as an amateur historian is not to remain silent or to cherry-pick what may be distasteful, but to confront it and, where appropriate, to say it is wrong. I remind myself that I cannot hide behind a shroud of Turin and write about perceived wrongs of some persons in the past while maintaining a perpetual silence about more egregious acts which may be happening under my very nose. I remind myself that I'm not the only person who has been baptized in the redemptive waters of fairness. I also remind myself that I must approach the shrine of scholarship with the humility of a penitent rather than with the haughtiness of a Pharaoh or a Pharisee. Let me repeat an admonition from the former Princeton University professor, Dr. Cornel West, at the commencement of every speech. I intend to say something in this speech which unsettles you. Where do I start in my assessment of the life of Edward Oliver Leblanc? Do I begin with the details of his life, his humble upbringing, his desire for a successful life, his creativity, his poetry, his painful awareness of the limitations which thwarted his hopes for higher education in the 1950s, and his resolute determination to forge a society on the anvil of a meritocracy and social equality? Or do I start with a conception of the man, his place in this political or historical firmament, the attributes of greatness that hold us in awe of the man, and the fact that today, more than 57 years after his major political victory in 57, the life and values of Edward Oliver Leblanc speak to us with a clarity and poignancy which resonate as much today as it did half a century ago. Let me get one thing out of the way. The life and legacy of Edward Oliver Leblanc should not be treated as if it was a prized piece of china or silverware to be taken out of the cabinet and dusted for display purposes, only to be put back out of sight and out of mind until the following National Day. The life and values of this man should renew and reinforce the values of every patriot, giving them the conviction and courage that honesty and integrity in governance is the legal tender that will ensure the productivity and prosperity of our island nation. How do I define the life of Edward Oliver Leblanc and his contribution to Dominica? We can well borrow the following words of Booker T. Washington, which Leblanc dutifully recorded. Quote, "I have learned that success is to be measured, not so much by the position one has reached in life, as by the obstacles which he or she has overcome while trying to succeed." Or we may reflect on the memorable words of Cassius in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Quote, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves." Make no mistake about it. The passage of time, more than 40 years after Edward Oliver Leblanc resigned from political office, has cemented his status as having been a colossus who walked the length and breadth of this sceptred isle and transformed it in a fashion that today we can look back with great nostalgia and sadly much regret. An assessment of Mr. Leblanc's contribution inevitably involves a consideration of the true dimension of greatness in political leadership. You see, greatness is oftentimes associated with transformative political figures such as Abraham Lincoln, Sir Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, and of course Nelson Mandela. And yet in the assessment of the greatness of these leaders, the inevitable question is asked: what degree of human perfection, or should I say imperfection, qualifies or disqualifies an individual for the designation of greatness? Abraham Lincoln liberated African slaves during the American War of Independence. He is considered great despite the fact that he owned slaves and was not particularly interested in offering them equality with their fellow Americans. So Winston Churchill is considered great largely because he embodied the indomitable spirit of defiance and determination that ultimately led to the defeat of the Nazi forces during World War II. And yet his shortcomings, such as his enduring fondness for libation and his resolute desire not to preside over the British Empire, the fall of the British Empire, have not diminished the high esteem in which he continues to be held. Nelson Mandela was prepared to sacrifice his life for his ideals, and yet in some quarters of the globe, he is still dismissed as a terrorist and communist. In defining the greatness of Edward Oliver Leblanc, I will focus on those qualities that place him solidly within the pantheon of leaders for whom the term greatness has been richly deserved. The first of these qualities I would identify is a degree of altruism bordering on messianism and incredible belief in the justice of his cause. Edward Oliver Leblanc's obsession to change his society was born of an awareness from an early age of the daily degradation of life which the laboring population, oftentimes dismissed as those country people they nag endured throughout their lives. The sale of their produce for a few yards of khaki cloth, the dismissive attitude exhibited towards them by many of those fortunate enough to have lived in more privileged surroundings, and the daily denial of opportunities for higher learning affected this man in a fundamental way that propelled him into the political arena. Phyllis Shanolfrey, who founded the Dominica Labour Party in 1955, did not have to pay Mr. Leblanc to become involved in the political process. By the time he joined the Labour Party, Mr. Leblanc had already formed a decision to try to change his society from within. When he was refused a scholarship for higher study, and after his supervisor advised him that the reasons for the slight was that he had not, quote, enjoyed the atmosphere of a secondary school, Leblanc became resolute. He did not descend into an abyss of despair. He decided to change a system where opportunities continued to be defined by the insidious combination of class and complexion. Now allow me to digress at this point. Edward Oliver Leblanc was denied an opportunity for higher education because he had not benefited from a secondary school education. Today, more than 60 years later, similar barriers are being erected to disqualify certain individuals from aspiring to leadership positions in Dominica. But we must place this misguided perception in its historical context. Before 1951, Dominica's electoral process was based on limited adult suffrage. The ownership of a certain quantum of property bestowed on an individual the right to vote. The assumption underlying this was that persons who did not own that quantum of property were not competent or sufficiently intelligent to exercise the right to vote. This business of not having won a tie, a code word for not having the social pedigree to exercise the freedom of choice to vote, was not limited to the right to vote or to hold elective office. It extended to other spheres of life. In 1967, the very year Dominica attained associated statehood, Mr. Philip Arlene, who is with us this evening, one of our most respected umpires, was the president of the Dominica Amateur Sports Association. Over the objections of a few members of the association's executive, he and others appointed Ed Augustus Gregoire, the late batsman and wicketkeeper, as captain of Dominica's national team. What objections did they raise to Gregoire's captaincy of the team? They stated that he had not won the tie. He allegedly did not possess the redeeming graces of a gentleman to lead the Dominican side. And yet, under Gregoire's leadership, the Dominica cricket team decimated its regional opponents in 1968 and 1969. We live in an age of virtual education. We live in an age where never in the annals of world history has information been more readily available than it is today. We live in an age where a university dropout is the richest man in the world. We live in an age where an enterprising man from Louisiana successfully studied to take the state bar associations on the internet and become a practicing lawyer despite never having set foot in a law school. Probably law is just easy, actually. The point is this: the technology and information revolution today has significantly diminished the need for attaining higher education in the form that we traditionally know it. However, it would obviously be wrong to suggest that a university education is not worth pursuing. On the contrary, our children should pursue it with all their strength and energy. But human intelligence has long existed and will continue to exist outside the perimeter of a university or college. You just have to read C.L.R. James's Beyond the Boundary and the Case for West Indies Self-Government to understand that the possession of a university degree is perhaps overstated. Edward Oliver Leblanc did not wear the tie, let alone earn a university degree. That, however, did not handicap him in any way, since that the degree that mattered for effective and transformational leadership was the degree of his commitment to create a society based on a meritocracy, the extraordinary degree to which he was an honest custodian of the state resources, and the degree to which he provided opportunities for Dominica to become productive citizens. In this regard, Edward Oliver Leblanc had all the degrees that mattered for the good governance of his island. In his final speech in 1974, he stated, quote, "The status symbols of the past, such as family connections, color, religious affiliation, dress, and attendance at secondary school exist no more to restrict or circumscribe the inherent right of the individual." Thank you. Perhaps he overstated the case, but we got the point. Those who today denigrate persons who have not attended or completed secondary school allegedly are woefully ignorant of the struggle waged so valiantly by Edward Oliver Leblanc. This leads me to the second aspect of Mr. Leblanc's greatness. It is this: he possessed an unmitigated desire to change his island for the better, despite overwhelming odds. It is not by coincidence that Edward Oliver Leblanc became known as the Little Rebel. He did not initiate the process of change in Dominica. Frank Barron, the astute political leader who dominated the 1950s, played a significant role in the transformation of Dominican society. However, Mr. Leblanc accelerated it significantly in the 1960s. He did so by defying the social and political conventions of his time. He provided opportunities for advancement in the civil service. He engendered opportunities for rural banana growers and opened up possibilities for them to send their children to secondary schools. He built a vast network of feeder roads and increased opportunities for employment in the colonial civil service. He made our institutions of learning more accessible to working-class Dominicans. He advanced the frontiers of democratic governance by nurturing the growth of village councils all over the island. He scrupulously maintained the integrity of the electoral process. He instituted land reform measures, although, quite frankly, not comprehensive enough in certain places or parts of Dominica. And this leads me to the third aspect of his extraordinary leadership. Edward Oliver Leblanc embraced, and in so doing, embodied the hopes and aspirations of his people to a degree hitherto unknown. The man who had an intimate relationship with poverty in his youth fostered a deep sense of pride in persons who had been traditionally dismissed as less than equal. He was an unapologetic proponent of the equality of all, the equal treatment of all without regard to race, color, class, or creed. He sought to dismantle the institutions of colonial rule, not to feather his own political nest, but because they had subjugated the majority of Dominica's working population for decades. He articulated the aspirations of his constituents with a clarity and perspicacity which endeared him to Dominicans as no other leader could. He rejected the cynical and capricious Machiavellian belief that in politics, the end justifies the means, that a leader must be deceitful when it suited his purpose. He did not talk about change while manifesting a slavish subservience to those who stood as the main bulwark against change. And this takes me to one central aspect of my biography of Edward Oliver Leblanc, which I will confront head-on at this point. In the biography, I wrote that at one point in Portsmouth during the 1966 visit of Queen Elizabeth II, Leblanc had stood on a podium and suddenly raised his right hand with the clenched fist of a Black Power salute. I went on to say that without violating any of the archaic rules of protocol or uttering anything disrespectful about his distinguished guests, Leblanc had signaled to all assembled that the true rulers in Dominica were the representatives of the laboring population. Dr. Honeychurch, in his Edward Oliver Leblanc lecture last November, suggested that this interpretation was nothing short of blasphemy. He stated that I had merely looked at a picture and wrongfully interpreted Mr. Leblanc's actions. He noted that it seemed to him that the poor man was merely shouting, "Hip hip hooray, God save the Queen." With the greater of respect, this interpretation is simplistic and does not reflect an appreciation of the complexities of Edward Oliver Leblanc, the individual leader, or the history of struggle of those Leblanc represented. Let me first respond to Dr. Honeychurch by borrowing Shakespeare's admonition in Hamlet that I know not seems. Neither Dr. Honeychurch nor I know what was in Leblanc's mind when he raised his fist in the presence of the Queen in Portsmouth. As Shakespeare again cautioned in Macbeth, there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. And you can ask Mrs. Levy, who was my English teacher, exactly what I'm talking about. All we can do is to look at the context in which Mr. Leblanc acted or spoke and draw any reasonable inferences from the facts. Dr. Honeychurch complained that I cannot simply look at a photograph. Fine, no problem. Let us look at the evidence and see what reasonable inferences we can draw from it. 1. From 1957, when he was first elected to political office, Edward Oliver Leblanc manifested a complete disdain for the colonial administration in Dominica. 2. One of the first things he did after taking office in 1961 was to instruct his permanent secretaries to invite local Dominicans to official functions rather than the white English expatriates. Listen to his explanation for doing so in a speech in the House of Assembly in October 1973. Quote, "Why should I belong to a black country to go to a cocktail party given by the government of the people, and all I see only white people instead of black people?" 3. In 1962, his government deported Mr. Hopkins, a white master at the Dominica Grammar School who had kicked a schoolboy. 4. In October 1965, he changed the annual November 3rd celebrations and called them Dominica Day rather than Discovery Day, with an emphasis on indigenous song rather than songs praising the British Empire. He invited Pan-Africanist and World War II veteran Edward Scobie to come to Dominica to organize the festivities. 5. The Queen came to Dominica within a month of Leblanc winning the most lopsided political victory in Dominica, and after he had defeated the last remaining political giant, who he regarded as an integral part of this exclusive and discriminatory world of colonial privilege. 6. Edward Oliver Leblanc, according to Dame Eugenia Charles's biography, Janet Higby, refused to wear a tie to work and justify his actions by telling an Ebony magazine reporter, quote, "We have been acting like white men long enough." 7. I love number 7. It has some biblical significance. As Mr. Rupert Sorondo wrote in a March 22nd, 1974 article in The Star at page 2, paragraph 5, quote, "Mr. Leblanc told listeners in Collie-Ho that they should take down the picture of the Queen in their village and replace it with that of Congo Ray." Now, ladies and gentlemen, as my nephew told me some time ago, let us set the joke aside. Is this the same man who, it is claimed, was so titillated by the presence of the Queen that he succumbed to an overwhelming desire to shout, "Hip hip hooray, God save the Queen"? We should resist the temptation of trying to recreate Edward Oliver Leblanc in our own image. There are 2 other reasons why Edward Leblanc's actions defy this simplistic explanation. First, it ignores the whole history of African reaction to subjugation and the distinction between what seems and the reality that lurks beneath. This is a consistent theme not only in the history of slave rebellion, but also in the literature spawned by such rebellion. And for those of you who are acquainted with song, remember Billie Holiday's, what was the name? Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. The beautiful magnolia trees and the poplar trees in Southern American states, they have historically borne a terrible fruit: the dead bodies of lynched African Americans. We know not seems. C.L.R. James, we know who C.L.R. James is, has shown in his classic, The Black Jacobins, even privileged slaves like Toussaint Louverture, who danced minuets and quadrilles for the delight of their masters, masked his deep desire to break the handcuffs of subjugation. It is not by coincidence that this duality resonates throughout the literature of freedom. Consider, for example, the following lines in Paul Dunbar's poem, We Wear the Mask. Quote, with torn and bleeding hats we smile, and hides with myriad subtleties. Consider the following lines from Edward Brathwaite's poem, The Arrivants. Quote, beneath the docile smile lies this unbridled monster's breath. Consider the anti-hero in Ralph Ellison's classic Invisible Man, who wears a mask of docility which hides an apocalyptic interiority. The second reason reflects another aspect of Edward Oliver Leblanc's greatness that makes him exceptional among his regional counterparts. It is this: his determination to effect social change was not overpowered by any ambivalence towards the colonial power or obsession with the trappings of power. We are all familiar with Lord Acton's observation that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, many 20th century political leaders in the Eastern Caribbean suffered from one of two maladies. And let me express the caveat that I am not a doctor. Speak to Dr. Pascal and Dr. Shillingford about what I'm saying to you in a minute or two. An obsession with the trappings of power and a craving for acceptance by the colonial power. In 1932, leaders such as C.E.A. Rawle, J.B. Charles, Howell Shillingford, and J. Arich Kazemi organized the West Indian Conference to agitate for West Indies Federation. With the exception of trade unionist Albert Marichou from Grenada, they all opposed the immediate granting of universal adult suffrage for the West Indian people. C.L.R. James later wrote the epitaph of this generation of leaders in his 1932 book, The Case for West Indian Self-Government. They were motivated, he wrote, by one overarching concern: acceptance by the colonial society. In 1942, Dr. Eric Williams, in his book, The Negro in the Caribbean, wrote the following about these leaders, quote, a government appointment for one, an invitation to Buckingham Palace for the other, and the radicals vanished into thin air. Of Albert Marichou, and bear in mind that Albert Marichou was the sole one who supported universal adult suffrage in 1932, here is what historian Gordon K. Lewis wrote in his book, The Growth of the Modern West Indies. Marichau's vanity, his enjoyment of Buckingham Palace garden parties and parliamentary receptions at Westminster, and his comic pursuit of royal personages all made it impossible for him to lead that open fight for democratic change. Phyllis Sharolfrey, she made a tremendous contribution to Dominica with the founding of the Dominica Labour Party in 1955, with her newspaper, The Star, and with her works of fiction. However, Alfrey's biographer, Lisbeth Paravicini Gibbert, in her excellent book, corroborates Lewis and even notes that Alfrey once described her daughter at a public meeting as a princess from England. Lewis observed that Fabian socialism had not stifled in Alfrey an obvious pride in belonging to the royal family of Dominica. I didn't know we had one, but that's fine. During the Queen's visit to Dominica in 1966, Alfrey's newspaper was saturated with story after story about the Queen's couriers, the royal coat of arms, the imperial state crown, and a story about why the Queen wore a hat. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against hats, folks. Edward Oliver Leblanc, among these small island leaders, stood alone in his indifference to either fraternizing with royalty or courting or craving the attention of royalty. The other trait of contemporary leadership, of which Edward Oliver Leblanc was entirely bereft, was an obsession with the trappings of power. Again, we can appreciate this aspect of Leblanc's greatness by comparing his life with that of his West Indian contemporaries. Here is V.S. Naipaul's brutal but candid assessment of Robert Bradshaw in his 1972 book, The Overcrowded Barracoon. Quote, Bradshaw is now a legend. For the gold swizzle stick he is reputed to bring out at parties to stir his champagne, the gold brush for his mustache, the formal English dress, even the silk hose and bottle shoes on some ceremonial occasions, the vintage yellow Rolls Royce. Here is the assessment of Tony Thorndike in an essay entitled Revolution, Democracy, and Regional Integration in the Eastern Caribbean In the book Modern Caribbean Politics by Anthony Payne and Paul Sutton, quote, Antigua over 2 decades acquired the regrettable image of being the most corrupt society in the Caribbean, Commonwealth Caribbean, hosting a notorious immorality from top to bottom. Thorndike further noted that an inquiry headed by the eminent British lawyer Louis Bloom Cooper recommended that Fairburn Sr. should never hold office for life. Archie Singham, the hero on the crowd in the colonial polity, describes the political leader who emerged in the terminal stage of colonial rule, personified in the figure of Eric Gary. The hero relied on populist measures to appease his political base. These measures, however, marked Gary's Caesarist tendencies as he, like a python, choked the life from his island's fledgling democracy. Hence, in Gary's Grenada, we had an unprecedented abuse of the public purse, dignified by the word squandermania. Gary and his ministers helped themselves to the coffers of the state with the energy, the enthusiasm, and etiquette of hyenas feasting on a carcass. Now, Gary was not so much a political liberal, but a mafia don, a godfather. His cultivation of a historic persona, aided and abetted by his ruthless secret police, the Mongoose Gang, ultimately led to politically motivated death in the 1970s and his eventual overthrow in 1979. Now, there are those who would suggest that Mr. Leblanc manifested a great deal of prejudice towards white people. Nothing could be further from the truth. One of his closest friends was Father Montpetit from Vecaz, the Roman Catholic priest who taught the young men of the village the rudiments of carpentry. Another was an American secular humanist, Arthur Warren Smith, who once wrote that Edward Leblanc should be spoken about in the same breath as Pericles, Thomas Paine, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Mr. Leblanc enacted the Aid to Pioneers Act in 1962, it benefited all Dominican persons, white, black, blue, or brown. One may conclude that by embracing his African heritage, while embracing his Caucasian friends, Mr. Leblanc was, to use or paraphrase Winston Churchill, an enigma wrapped in a conundrum within a paradox. But the reason for this apparent contradiction is clear. Edward Oliver Leblanc detected policies and philosophies which held one race superior, rather than persons of a different racial background or station in life. There are those who would suggest that Leblanc was not entirely free from the corrupting influence of absolute power. Indeed, they point to the passage of the Seditious and Undesirable Publications Act in 1968. His 1971 attempt to dissolve the opposition-dominated Roseau Town Council, his declaration of a state of emergency in 1973, and the placing of union leaders under house arrest as evidence that Mr. Leblanc did not manifest this clinical disinterest in absolute power, which is the hallmark of a great leader. Now, without doubt, the so-called shut-your-mouth bill was bad legislation designed to silence or control the voices of dissent in Dominica. But this legislation cannot be viewed in a vacuum. Rightly or wrongly, Mr. Leblanc felt that his attempts to achieve democratic reform were being stymied by the agents of privilege in Dominica. In any event, one piece of bad legislation does not a dictator make. We must therefore consider all the legislation enacted by the Leblanc government to get a true measure of the man and the cloth from which he was sewn. Now recall his 1966 beach control legislation, which vested ownership of all beaches in Dominica in the Crown, thereby ensuring that the Dominican people will always have access to the beaches. Recall his words that, quote, government will send a caterpillar to open a road to the beach because the beach belonged to the people of Dominica, and so we want the land to remain. Recall his Alien Landholding Act, which restricted foreign ownership of land in Dominica to a certain small percentage. I know you don't know what I'm talking about, but that's okay. Recall his October 1967 legislation, an act to exempt ex-servicemen from the payment of land and house taxes. The young men who had volunteered to fight in World War II. The young men who had to make their wills at age 19, 20, 21. Men like Mr. Glenworth Emmanuel. Edward Oliver Leblanc sought to ensure that for their sacrifice, they enjoyed sanctuary in their own homes. Recall his establishment of a National Provident Fund to provide a pension to any eligible Dominicans. Recall his enactment of the Christopher Leblanc Pensions Act in 1967, which conferred a pension on Mr. Leblanc for his tremendous contributions to the trade union movement. Recall his enactment of the Lawrence Clarison Didier Pension Act in 1970 to grant Mr. Didier, a former political ally of Mr. Leblanc's political opponent, a pension at the age of 81 years. Now, these two latter points lead me to a consideration of another significant aspect of Mr. Leblanc's greatness, Mr. Leblanc's magnanimity towards those over whom he had triumphed politically. The Labour Party expelled Phyllis Sharolfrey and Mr. Leblanc in 1962. It is reasonable to infer that this action had the endorsement of Mr. Leblanc. Thenceforth, Ms. Alfrey conducted a relentless and hate-filled campaign against Leblanc with the blessings of Leblanc. Do not take it from me, take it from Alfrey's biographer. And yet, despite this, Mr. Leblanc did two things to assist this humble man, Mr. Leblanc, who had helped to accelerate social and political change in Dominica. He granted him a pension in 1967, and he presented him with the Meritorious Service Award in the same year. And now we must move to another component of Mr. Leblanc's greatness. It is this. He did not marinate his unparalleled charisma and populism in narcissism or desire for self-aggrandizement. Recall Thorndike's indictment of the bankruptcy of political leadership in Antigua. The entire converse is true of Edward Oliver Leblanc. Examples abound of the conscientiousness of this man and his adamant refusal to enrich himself from the coffers of the state. He did so because, unlike many contemporary leaders, he did not suffer from moral malnutrition. Now, let me give you a few examples. Now, bear in mind the caveat I expressed. You do not have to take this from me. Let us look at the evidence. He repeatedly declined gifts of kind from well-established persons during his tenure in office. He once sacked a minister from accepting gifts from certain individuals. When his government opened the Canefield housing scheme in the 1960s, he refused to allow members of his own family to purchase lots to avoid even the appearance of preferential treatment. He guarded every penny of the nation's purse and expected his ministers to do the same. Now, there is another dimension to the extraordinary lengths to which the Premier went to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest in state business. He ensured that all his children attended secondary school. And I think one is with us, Aaron. They all acquitted themselves very well in their studies. I can personally attest to this, since one of them, who is now an accountant working for a Fortune 500 company in the United States, taught me the rudiments of accounting. Now, mind you, I didn't fare too well in the subject, but I am not holding that against him. Edward Oliver Leblanc scrupulously ensured that not a single one of his children benefited from a scholarship administered by his government for post-secondary education. In this regard, we see yet another quality of greatness which we can attribute to Edward Oliver Leblanc. He subjugated any desire to perpetuate himself in office for the overall good of his community. The chief minister fervently believed that democracy must be nourished and reinvigorated by a regular turnover of political leadership and the ability of the population to effect new leadership. Today, we can appreciate the rarity of this condition. Leblanc believed that he should serve as the leader of his island for 2 consecutive terms. He did not believe that he should rule Dominica by proxy or decrees, and hence he scrupulously refused to groom any of his sons to continue his legacy. He did not believe in the oxymoron called a dynastic democracy. He walked away from power and turned down the offer of the island's presidency when Dominica became an independent state in 1978. Which political leader can you name who literally strolled away from the portals of office? Which of them left political office with an overdraft balance of $465 in his savings account, $56.33 at one bank, and $25.77 in another. He had the keys to the vault. Yes. Today, 40 years after the departure of Mr. Leblanc, we can marvel at the unprecedented honesty of this man. Mr. Leblanc did nothing to perpetuate himself in power. He did not resurrect Santa Claus or Lazarus on the eve of a general election. He did not prorogue Parliament for the sole reason of avoiding a democratic vote of no confidence, as has happened in St. Kitts. Indeed, in 1970, he sacked 3 ministers and then daringly called elections, which he won resoundingly. And here we come to my next point. The English poet, John Keats, selected the following epitaph, which endures as the epitome of self-effacing humility. Quote, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." Mr. Leblanc manifested a clinical disinterest in recording his place in history or contributing towards documenting it. He refused to see many professionals who traveled to his residence to interview him. By sheer happenstance, I was spared that rejection. Before I wrote the biography of Mr. Leblanc in 2004, I was haunted by the report of this great man's disinterest in recording his life's work and contribution. And so one Sunday, I had visited Mr. Leblanc and his wonderful wife Ethel, thanks largely to my mother, who was his first cousin. My brother, who is here this evening, he survived it, had negotiated the Serpentine Road to Vacad with ominous sounding names such as Cassé-Cou. We had borne witness to the richness of the landscape, the angry agitation of the Atlantic, the procession of villagers, some with a ubiquitous cutlass in their hands and a bunch of bananas on their heads, and we had then understood the incredible hold of the rural landscape on the sensibility of this man. His house stood on the right next to a bay. A small neck of land extended beyond it into the sea. Misshapen almond trees, tormented by the wind, bent inwards as if in homage to the man who reposed within the residence. There were no tinted SUVs lazing around. There was no security detail, no pretension, no ostentation, just a modest concrete house we had entered. In beholding this modest abode, where the waves at Otru in the background resonated within its walls and the surrounding area, I was reminded and confronted with yet another facet of this man's greatness. Edward Oliver Leblanc vacated political office with his values intact. His philosophy of success was not based on the acquisition of material things, mansion, investments, or foreign bank accounts. Rather, it reflected the retention of those core values, honesty, simplicity, family, which defined this exceptional man to his very core. This is a rare quality which very few leaders possess. Mandela, Mahatma, Martin Luther easily comes to mind. Recently, Manmohan Singh, India's former prime minister, was voted out of office. This former World Bank economist with a PhD from Oxford retired earlier this year to a simple bungalow and a $1,000 monthly pension. He famously declared, quote, "I owe everything to this country, this great land of ours, where I, an underprivileged child, was empowered enough to rise and occupy high office. It is both a debt that I will never be able to repay and a decoration that I will always wear with pride." Edward Oliver Leblanc has earned a place in this pantheon of extraordinary and exemplary leaders. Holding public office was merely a debt to his country he was unable to pay, and one that he obviously wore with pride. He delighted in those things on which a proud and independent Dominica is based: farming, reaping what you sowed, teaching a grandson to fish. No, there's nothing wrong with buying a fish, obviously. Giving a son an autographed book of his poems. In short, he focused on building character rather than building bank accounts. There is a central paradox in the life and departure of this man from political office. Edward Oliver Leblanc manifested a perpetual distrust of organized religion throughout his life. Now, I will not bore you with the words he used to describe certain members of the established church in 1957. Indeed, The Roman Catholic Church, Your Lordship, warned its members during the 1957 general elections not to vote for Phyllis Sharolfrey and the other members of the Labour Party. And yet this man exemplified one of the most profound teachings of the established church, to an extent significantly greater than a few members of that very church. What doth it profit a man who gains the whole world but loses his soul? Now, Father, His Lordship, if I sound like a born-again preacher, then I am not. It merely seems that is the case. I know that we now live in an age where religious teachings are often based on a self-serving doctrine called the prosperity gospel. I know that we live in an age where success is sometimes measured by the amount of money church members contribute to their preacher's birthday party. I know that we live at a time when many persons embrace a self-serving reductionist logic, which holds that all our past leaders, including Dame Eugenia Charles, were all corrupt, and so there is no need to worry about corruption in public office. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have produced great sportsmen. We have produced doctors. We have produced ophthalmologists. We have produced ENT specialists. We have produced jurists. We have produced religious leaders. And today, you are telling me that we should accept the cynical conception of Dominica's history, which essentially holds as if it is a biblical admonition that corruption will be with us always. We must reject that fallacy. I also know that Edward Oliver Leblanc's refusal to profit from public office has attracted the derision and ridicule of some of our present-day scribes and Pharisees. They ridicule him for not coveting gifts of land. They ridicule him from not having backhoes made in making money in Dodin. They ridicule him from not having bank accounts in Switzerland. And so Edward Oliver Leblanc's humble abode was not a monument or citadel of greed. It stood as a symbol of honest service, and the home of a man who resolutely resisted the seduction or obsession to advance one's stations in life at the expense of taxpayers or of the treasury. Walk with me from outside the porch to the area within. In the living room stood a table and chairs made from local wood. There were no mementos of 13 years he spent as chief minister or premier of Dominica. There were no framed photographs with the political giants in the region, Dr. Eric Williams, Sir Grantley Adams, Norman Washington Manley. There were no pictures depicting the 2 years he spent in this federal legislature. There were no pictures of foreign leaders or of Her Majesty the Queen. There were no gilded cages, no delicate china or prized silverware. There were no framed awards, citations, or certificates. There were no MBEs, OBEs, or CBEs, or just CBs. There were no mementos of a glorious past. There were no delicate embroidery or burnished mahogany. What kind of man was this? Rather, they were simple words he had etched on the surface of his children's mind. One read, quote, "Manners maketh man, reading maketh a fool man." He forced his children to memorize the following lines of Rudyard Kipling's poem, quote, "If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foe or loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that is it. And what is more, you will be a man, my son." But let us continue the journey through the house. In an adjoining room was a window overlooking the bay. Mr. Leblanc sat a few feet away from a television. Behind him was a bookcase some 4 feet high, stocked with books, pamphlets, and other reading materials. Here was a man who had obviously reflected on the words of Marcus Tullius Cicero that a room without books is like a body without a soul. He had addressed my mother by her first name. They had engaged, if I may quote St. Lucian author Gav St. Omer, in his now any country, in the superficiality of jest, the comfort of reminiscence, end of quote. He had made an offer of a glass of brandy. His wife had retrieved some from a glass decanter. At a certain point, his conversation with my mother had subsided. Mrs. Leblanc had looked at me as if to signal that now was the time to broach the subject of a biography with her husband. I gulped the brandy down. I saw a few stars in the deep recesses of my mind. I had rehearsed how I would approach the subject. Should I deploy an academic tone seasoned in flattery by telling him that I desired to research the extraordinary details of his life, blah, blah, blah? Or should I employ a more down-to-earth tone by saying, as though I want to write something about you? Fortuitously, my mother had intervened. She'd asked him if he remembered her son. He replied yes. He admitted to having read a couple of the books I'd done. He had then paused. The moment of truth had arrived. He wasn't opposed, but he stated simply, I was just doing my job. He kept repeating the simple sentence, I was just doing my job, the humility of this man. Had I been in a position, I would have talked about every accomplishment that I had and I did not have, including winning a race where I was the only runner. We had departed the house a couple of hours later. I subsequently benefited from the generosity of his family, his friends, former colleagues, and even those with whom he had bitterly parted company. Without the contributions of these persons, the biography of Edward Oliver Leblanc would not have been written. And so today we stand, to use another Shakespearean expression, on the bank and shores of time, the proud beneficiaries of this great man who sought to build character rather than chalets, and to unleash the productive capacity of his people rather than increase their dependency. 1 year before he left office, he was preoccupied with the growing evidence of lawlessness in Dominica. He was preoccupied with the disrespect for law and order, the disregard for property, the false sense of entitlement, and the increasing incidence of gratuitous violence, which culminated in murder in February '74 and the burning down of Geneva Estate and Elias Nassif's flagship building in April 1974. Concerned that the genie of intolerance and racial hatred had been let loose from the bottle, Edward Oliver Leblanc retreated, to use George Laming's metaphor, within the castle of his kin, and penned a memorable poem which he called Nom Noir, Black Man, in which he poetically addressed his Dominican brethren, quote, although your hands are still tied behind your back, your mind is free, but liberty has its price. Your race and roots are not things to play with. Love all, but love your own much more. Work hard, forgive, and pray. Your horizon is plain. Cut your own road. With courage, your destiny to mold the intensity of this man. Edward Oliver Leblanc, the man who never wore the tie, the man who never benefited from a tailwind of privilege, or secondary school education for that matter. The man derided as a pretender to the office of political leadership in Dominica has left us an extraordinarily profound definition of the true meaning of self-liberation and nationhood. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a lovely audience. I thank you for listening.
I am thinking about your delivery, and there are many, many thoughts can go into my mind. But I'm thinking of your Leblanc just about 40 years ago. This way the left that defines a generation. And we see a leader, as you described, selfless, altruistic, honest, who was prepared to leave office with nothing. And 40 years later, we see there's been a complete sea turn. We see a group of leaders that are completely completely opposed to what we saw 40 years earlier. And I'm thinking about the reflection on the Dominican society. What does that tell us about the Dominican society? Because we have, for example, today leaders that are basically being accepted by the population when they stand and beat their chests proudly to declare the Constitution has no impact on them, who tell people go to hell, and so on. And leaders who, as you rightly described, who said they will not come out like Leblanc and so on, who placed so much on it. And I'm curious to find out if, what from your own study of E.O. Leblanc, and I've been spoken to him and I've been studying him very closely, what would he, if he were alive today, what would be his comment on Dominican society?
That's an interesting I am just a spokesman. I'm just well, it's interesting, but again, bear in mind what I said. Leblanc worked assiduously to achieve change. Leblanc worked to ensure that all Dominicans, regardless of, as I said, race, color, class, or creed, social position, and so on, had an equal opportunity to succeed. And I think to that extent, Leblanc would be motivated if he perceived that those dreams or those goals have been aborted. It seems to me that, quite frankly, it's something which would be of deep concern to him, because that was the very foundation of his life. That is what he sought to achieve. So quite frankly, it seems to me that what you've described is a negation, obviously, of his philosophy. Yes, sir.
What I would like to say, in the case of pension, you mentioned two pensions that Mr. E.O. Leblanc
Yes.
legislated in Parliament. You mentioned two that you, I don't know whether it was inadvertently omitted or otherwise, but there is also a third one, the RP St. Louis.
Okay, that's one. Yes.
Now, that's one. Another thing, when you talk about Mr. Leblanc having fired his prime minister,
Yes.
went to the election,
That's right.
because he won, he did not give any further detail on that. I'm not again, it was just deliberate. But what he really said, after he fired this man because of the court case, and he had lost his symbol, hat,
Yeah.
it was the original symbol of labor,
Yes.
which came from the Dominica trade union,
Right.
which contested the 1951 adult suffrage first ever general election
Yes.
on the universal adult suffrage. The symbol was that when the Labour Party was formed in 1955, at the very office of the Dominica trade union under the British office, and Leopold Charles, I didn't mention that, was vice president. Mr. Leblanc came in 1957 and contested the election, because in 1956 you have the ministerial system. Now, what happened is, Mr. Leblanc, when he went, after having lost the court case against the ministers who were executive of the Labour Party, they decided to go into the election under the Leblanc Labour Party symbol. Sure.
Yeah, well, all that is documented in the book, Mr. Bernard Nicholas. But just to protect the record, he fired them first. He fired the three ministers first, and then there was the court case, the fight.
Yes.
Right. All right.
So that's why they changed the law.
The question?
Now, would you also agree that Mr. Leblanc was a very astute representation, very astute politician? With the Federation, he saw it was coming to an end and decided to stay closer home.
Right.
And that is how he became the leader of the Labour Party, went his office as a minister in the federal election. By the time he brought up, she came, and she had no place. And of course, I don't want to prolong that, but I just wanted to draw this parallel so that, you know, you could this one back.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So the question was,
Yeah, I didn't get the question, but I understand. That's it.
I'm sure that, you know, he was astute enough to see the Federation coming to an end, and so left before the Federation ended.
Yes, but he was no different from the other leaders, and all politics is local. So when he saw the end, he decided obviously to protect his turf, and he did precisely that. Yes, he was very astute. He was very brilliant. He's the only politician who contested in a number of constituencies where the major politicians of the day ruled as omnipotent beings. He did so, as you know, in Portsmouth. He did so, as you know, in Roseau. He did so, as you know, in the coast in '66. Exactly. So you're absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you. congratulate you for such a wonderful delivery, and protocol already set. Thanks for clearing up the differences between yourself and Lennox and so on regarding your views on the uplifted feast, because I was really concerned when I read your book, especially when you explained very clearly the reasons why he took Leo Austin over Clark as Attorney General. And a man so astute and who was preparing, like the other countries, Dominica, for constitutional independence, I could not understand how he would, in a black power ideologist action, lift up his fist in the presence of the Queen when he's trying to beg them to get good and proper independence. That really confused me. And for that reason, I really reflected on the views of Lennox on it when he made that point. But you clarified that today. I'm happy you did that. Okay? The second thing is, in your book, you did not clarify a lot of Edward Leblanc's work regarding preparing Dominica to avoid the approach of a communist ideology, which was also tied with the leftists, with the Black Power movement. And
well, that's an interesting comment, but I think you might be you overstepped in your argument, quite frankly. I don't think it's quite correct. Let's put it that way. Why? Because bear in mind what happened. Why did he not choose Bobby Clark? Because he feared his communist proclivities. Why did he deport certain persons? Why was he upset with members of the Black Power movement in the 70s? Remember his famous speech? Well, I quoted part of it in the book. He regarded himself as a centrist. He boasted and took pride in the fact that he resented the conservatism of the period, but he also was distrustful of the radicalism which emerged in the late 60s and 70s. He made it clear that he saw himself as a centrist in that regard. So, again, with great respect, I disagree with you when you suggest that I didn't confirm or clarify why he had issues with those who may have professed a communist ideology. I'm not saying that they did. I'm saying they may have, because the good thing is that's what 40 years does to us. We can reflect and look at some of the acolytes, and we can ask ourselves, to what extent were they altruistic? We can look at some of them in the environmental movement and say, well, at least they remain true to the ideological roots. But we can look at some others and see how they have prospered in the land of plenty. Or the land of empty, I'm sorry.
Just one last comment. What is your view regarding his movement from the grassroots, getting the support of the local grassroots and those uneducated persons, if we should take it that way, who were his main advisors and those who more or less moved him into politics, all right, with support and everything, and the way he maintained their support, compared to those who got such propelling action, but afterwards would walk away from it and choose the educated professionals over those people, and thus end up with major problems. What are your views on that?
The views are quite clear, and that was the genius of Edward Leblanc. Power was not an alienating force in his life. He did not become what he derided. He remained true to his roots. And that is the genius. That's why he was so loved by the Dominican people. He eschewed those symbols of achievement. I mean, he didn't ride in this nice big car presented by Jojo Karam or whoever. He introduced Sir Jackson, yes, from probably the Guyanese experience and so on. But to him, the purpose of being in politics was to serve and to advance the goals and aspirations of his people. That no one, not even his opponents, can argue otherwise. Now, bear in mind one thing: they called him corrupt. They called him corrupt. Read Phyllis Sharolfris' The Star. You know, we can't get away from history. It's there. Thank you. Yes, sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't see you, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Andre. Thanks for your enlightening lecture. I'd just like to ask you to clarify one thing. Your help me with one thing. I've always but I don't call it the retreat. When Mr. Leblanc left the
arena,
went to live in Vegas, even as a young sixth former like yourself, I could never understand it. And I just wanted you to comment on the fact that one of the things you said was that and the other thing I like to say is that I like to see history as a living organism, not just the past.
Right.
So I'd like if you think there are any lessons for us now, especially our politicians and political leadership, let's think about the obsession with the trappings of power. And whether you would comment on the fact that maybe Mr. Leblanc hadn't recognized, as you alluded to somewhat, that there was the acts of the past that may have been, he was now being infected with that virus, so to speak, of the trappings of power.
Yes.
And being the great man he was, since that's the treatment of those things. Dr. Benjamin isn't there. Treatment of the
just as well.
Or the myth of. So
yes.
could you kindly comment?
Well, and again, bear in mind the task of the writer, the historian, is to draw reasonable inferences based on evidence before you or me and so on. We can look at Edward Oliver Leblanc and ask ourselves, why did he do so? And bear in mind what was happening in the early 70s. There was union militancy. Now, I know that there's no one here who remembers these days, but there was union militancy. All right? Bear in mind there was dissension from within, right? Bear in mind that there was an oil crisis in 73. And my view, bear in mind that he declared a state of emergency in 73 also, if my memory serves me right. But my view is this: Libya fed to a significant degree the corrupting influence of power on his own self. And he did the one thing which only the rarest of political leaders would do. He retreated from office. And bear in mind one thing: he did not do so because he saw the political writing on the wall. He did not do so because he feared that he would lose the next election. He did not win one seat in 1970 and said, Gasso, I'm not going through this again. He left because it seems to me that he felt he could walk away from this without looking back and without worrying about the wonderful perks of office. Do you understand what we're talking about here, Dr. IP?
And Dr. Andre, thanks
Yes.
very much for a wonderful lecture. I had the occasion to ask Mr. Leblanc, Christopher Leblanc, how long again he thought it would take for the average Caribbean politician, and more particularly the average Dominican politician, to become mature and statesmanlike. Leblanc took a deep breath and he said it wouldn't take too long again, only another 2,000 years. Now, Leblanc or no Leblanc, these two gentlemen have their differences. In view of what you have seen on the political landscape here in Dominica and of the rest of the Caribbean, do you think Mr. Leblanc's estimate for advancing majority was unduly optimistic?
You want me to be quoting scripture tonight, for God's sake. Well, I'm an optimist. Look, I mean, look at where we are today. Just look around this room. Look at the number of distinguished persons here. Look at the number of distinguished persons Dominica has produced. We have the wherewithal to produce, to have a transformative leader who can look at the bigger picture, a transformative leader who can see Dominica is more than the sum of its individual parts, a transformative leader which can say that, yes, I do not have to have A, B, C to be a man. I can stand up and feel good that I have advanced the cause of my people. Are you suggesting to me that we do not have the wherewithal to produce that type of leader? I think we do, but we have to dig deep within ourselves to do so. And I think the survival of Dominica depends on that type of leadership. I think it's a regional problem, quite frankly. It's a regional problem spawned, unfortunately, by the American war on drugs, because the Caribbean, as you know, is now a transit for drug importation into North America, Canada, and the United States. We have to contend with what our religious leaders will tell us probably is a gospel of greed. And it's not something, it's a pervasive culture. We have to deal with those types of issues. And yes, there's no doubt that I will be pilloried by some individual and so on, but that will not change the price of a pound of sugar. We still have to face the reality, quite frankly. So I think we have the wherewithal to produce that leader. Where is he or she? I don't know, but I know that we can. And I'm not trying to plagiarize Obama's "yes, we can" mantra. Yes, Inspector George.
Good evening, Doctor. For a moment there, I thought that you were speaking of Oliver Leblanc and his grandson, because I want to say to you that I have retired from the police service and have decided to contest the next general.
I thought you were going to say you've decided to follow Jesus, but sorry, I was mistaken. I'm sorry.
Yes, in my public utterances, I have invoked with the name of Edward Oliver Dominica. He contested the election in Qualiho, and I'm from Qualiho. He was an agriculturist at our agricultural station. I was also a student agriculturist there. And I have been speaking about his virtues. So when I heard you speak tonight, I feel fortified to continue along the road that you've been speaking. And I want to show you that I'm going to make an attempt to ensure that our political system changes and that we reinstitute the beliefs, philosophies of Edward Oliver Leblanc. I have one last thing to say. If we want to complete the history, or want to progress the history of Leblanc, we need to do something for him in Qualiho. When the highway was named after him, the bus was coming from Roseau to Qualiho, and they inadvertently stopped at Belfast. I do not know that there was a storm, or there was a flood, or there was anything to stop it, but it stopped. And I'm appealing probably through you to have...
I'm a powerless young man.
Well, His Excellency the President is there.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We probably could ask for divine intervention from our Bishop and the state intervention from His Excellency the President. Because it was in Qualiho that Leblanc had his biggest fight in the opening of this highway.
Quite true.
And it was at Boulogne where he had the fight with Howell Chillingford, who professed that General Leon could not have been caught. And therefore, to have inadvertently left this bus in honor of the highway being named after him in Maho, I think is an incomplete journey. And as a candidate, I am saying that I would like to see that bus, that highway opening, be removed from Maho and placed where it rightfully should be, in the village of Qualiho. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything is possible, my friend. From a biblical perspective, bear in mind that one of the apostles was saved on the road to Damascus. So there's hope for all of us. Sorry, yes, Mr. Prevost.
Dr. Andre, thank you very much. I read your book on Oliver Leblanc, and you give camera book. I have copious notes in the cup. I've read it many times. My first encounter, first of all, when my colleague here spoke about a bus.
Yes.
I first thought it was a bus traveling. But reflection, I realized he's referring to the bus in Maho by Belfast.
Okay.
So, my first experience with Mr. Leblanc was as a primary school student, standard 5 in Maryland, when he came there with Will Stratton Stevens campaigning. But my most historic interaction with him was that I was present at the Goodwin Parish Hall in 1974 when he gave his parting address at his resignation.
Was that a private meeting? Was that a private meeting?
No, it was a meeting like this.
That's okay, I understand. I understand, that's okay. I'm just teasing you, Mr. Prevost.
So I actually saw him walking on the stairs and drive.
Yes, yes.
You walked us through his final residence. I knew him and I knew where he lived before he moved to Oak Park in his final residence. Because on many an evening, when I drove up to the cars with my new wife, I would drive past Mama Ido's house, past Mr. Rizla's house where he lived in the light, opposite the new palace, and turn and come back. I wondered whether you may have sort of explored the home where he lived before, and whether you could share anything about it with us. Do any complete that journey of his life? That is my substantial question. Well, I want to place in the record that, to my mind, Leblanc's most important contribution is not just to Dominica, but to democracy. Leblanc's decision to resign from power after 2 or 3 terms, I believe, is a statement for democracy in the Caribbean, which we in Dominica need to embrace. The people of Jamaica and Barbados over the years had virtually embraced it in the sense that they never elected the government in more than 2 terms. This is shaken up. And in the case of Dominica, we certainly have lost that tremendous legacy that they will enforce in terms of 2 terms being enough for government, for prime minister, for person with head of. And certainly, I do want our people in Dominica to reflect on this great contribution, similar to the contribution of the founders of the American Constitution, that to protect our democracy, 2 terms is enough. So please reflect for us if you did have the opportunity to journey into the movement.
Yeah, well, again, as I said, it was very interesting and very enlightening and very sobering, to be quite frank with you. Obviously, you know, we draw a mental picture as to what a leader of the caliber of Edward Oliver Leblanc should be. And going into the House was almost a reaffirmation of a certain type of religious conviction, which was very paradoxical, because Leblanc was not a devout Catholic. In fact, as I said, in 1957, he had quite choice words for the role of religion in Dominican society. But there was he, and it was very much part of his well-being, very much a part of his belief system, that he occupied this almost monastic type of existence. And I think it's a testament to his wife that she accepted it without questioning, because she understood how significant it is to him. And I think when we reflect on that, we have to say, yes, this is an extraordinary thing. Because quite frankly, the typical Joe public, or certainly as I said, if it was myself, I would have a different approach. That's what it is. I would erect monuments to my vanity, for example. You know, I would certainly do. I would have framed photographs of every dignitary I met, and every degree that I did not have, and every race I did not win, and so on and so forth. But again, by looking at that, you can appreciate the nature of the man. And it's not because, you know, that we may have a political difference of opinion. We can't respect somebody else. I mean, Eugenia Charles, for example, I disagree with the suggestion that she was some corrupt leader, to be quite frank with you. Why? Because her actions, the way she died, what she did or didn't do with her legacy, it doesn't reflect that. It's a repudiation of that assessment. But why should we say those things? Because it suits us politically. Why? I see Mr. Arlene is next to you. I wonder if he shares that perception. I don't think he does. Anyway, that's for another day. Yes, sir.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Leblanc, better known as Gigi from Senegal. So since I have written a book from 2010, it seems to have catch fire on my foot, a desire in my heart to know what that great man was. And to be here tonight, I find it great. I feel good to be here and to listen to your lecture. But there's chapter 10 of your book. I'm wondering if there is something that you can implement into the politicians or those who are going to read us. At the account of chapter 10, at the time of gum fruit and gum can timber, seeing that Dominica is still in this form of having this thing reproduce, what are your implements? What would have you to tell these politicians who are supposed to come back and bring us back to where we're supposed to be?
Well, I wouldn't venture to tell them anything because they wouldn't listen. I am powerless in that regard. I can't even get my daughter to do anything. But your point is well taken, because ironically and paradoxically, Leblanc was condemned because of his lack of education. He didn't know economics. And yet in 63 or 64, you had the Dominica coconut products being established. You had Dom Fruit, which went under, not because of his fault. You had local industry. You had the production of coconut fiber mattress, which I believe Dr. Severin still has. You had industry. Huh? I will let you make the comparison. Sorry. Sorry, Doc. It was supposed to be a secret, but that's okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, you mentioned something about the Geneva Uprising.
Sorry?
The Geneva Uprising.
Right, exactly.
Could you explain a little bit about that and Leblanc's impression of that uprising?
Yes, and it's a good question, because there's a general perception that this is a glorious instance of revolution. Everybody has to decide from their own perspective to what extent was it a revolution. Again, the question of the struggle of the Granberian people for land, quite frankly, was well documented throughout the 20th century. But what wasn't documented is the overtures made from the 50s to offer significant portions of the Geneva estate for the Granberian people for village improvement and for village expansion. You see, unfortunately, we can't cherry pick the evidence that we want, you know. There is a significant evidence, in particular in the House of Assembly debates, from the 50s, that on numerous occasions there were offers of land from Elias Nassif to the government to purchase land on behalf of the Granberian people. In fact, there were also offers of land to the Mahu people. You see? And this is one of the reasons why the Mahu people decided they're not joining any revolution, regardless of what you want to describe it, in 1974. Why? Because they were reaping the benefits of a bonanza called the Dominica coconut products. They had benefited from free offers of land and free gifts of land after the destruction of Hurricane David. So you see, we can't cherry pick the evidence. We have to look at it. And sometimes we can't have the ideology and look for evidence to support that ideology. But there is no doubt that the availability of arable land was a factor that afflicted and affected the Granbarian people for decades. And again, it seems to me that unfortunately, what happened in '74 was a culmination of that apathy, the fact that nothing had been done to ameliorate and to give the Granbarian people additional arable land, which is a function of the government, mind you, as opposed to the function of an individual. And I think that is what culminated in the disaster of 1974. Some persons call it a revolution. Well, again, it depends on your perspective. One would ask, well, what's happening in Granby today? So, but I leave that to you to decide. You know better than I. Yes, His Honor.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. Chair, this was a wonderful lecture, and it would be a pity, I think, that its life depends on our own personal memory, which is why I don't have a question for our lecturer, but I have a suggestion that this lecture should be, it's been recorded obviously, it should be published in a booklet, a book, whatever it is, the discussion after as well, but particularly the lecture should be put into a permanent form and published and circulated to the public of Dominica and the region. And I want to say that the university should undertake this, and that I personally am prepared to contribute. So I know these things cost money, and while I'm a poor pensioner,
Your Honor, you're giving poverty a bad name.
I'm personally prepared to contribute to the cost of publishing this evening's event. Thank you to the university for undertaking this. Thank you, Doctor, for the breadth and width and depth of your contribution. And I'm sure we all benefited tremendously. And not only those of us here tonight, that's why I want to contribute to giving this a level of posterity beyond our personal memories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. That's okay, no problem.
Good evening, Dr. Andre.
Yes, sir.
Jerry Charles.
Yes, Jerry.
Yeah, and I come in the name of the now promoted slogan that change is a must. I want to say to you also, Dr. Andre, if I do not get to see you after tonight, I want you to give your regards to your wife and your children, and I also ask you to give my best wishes to your sister, Celia.
What? I'm sorry, it just came out. I mean,
in your opening remarks, Dr. Andre, your very first quote was a ventilation of free expression.
Right.
And I get by way of mentioning, Doctor, do you know that our present king, King Dice, that he was censored recently when he had to perform at the national event, which just passed a couple of days, the Creole Festival, where he was told what songs to sing. Are you aware of that, Doctor?
No.
Okay, then. That aspect about it, you will deal with it later as I go along. And was it by accident, Doctor, that one of our most prolific writers, Pat Aaron, who wrote for our present king, King Dice, and he won 7 times, that was left out in your remarks when you were praising or giving accolades to a few writers in Dominica? Was it by accident, Doctor? Or you do not follow carnival?
Yeah.
Or you do not follow our cultural carnival.
You think so?
Well, I don't know because let's face it, doctor. There is a man they call Pat Iran who have wrote for a man 7 times and he had gone from. Does it put him in a certain echelon? A doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So much for that dog. Let me come to another thing. Can I speak for you, doctor? Can I speak for you, sir, honestly, by saying that you yourself is your opinion? And I heard you talk when you spoke during your lecture about the corruption aspect, or when you made the delivery on corruption, that you are of the opinion that we have accepted it, but you are saying that it should never be accepted.
Of course not, it shouldn't be accepted.
Exactly. That is what I don't know for the rest of you all, but that is what I digested, that you are telling us, not directly, but you are telling us that corruption should never be accepted in Dominica. Now I made another remark there, let me see if I can flip it off. But I must say, doctor, let me tell you.
Yes.
I plan to come and see you, come and listen to that lecture tonight. But as the time came closer, because I think those sort of lectures, if you notice this sort of people and them that comes inside here to listen to those lectures, we basically, and I'm not mean trying to say that the avenue is not good, but the caliber of people, as Leblanc would say, somehow we are missing out, because of the venue, because the local man, like myself, I mean, I will take my chances and come here because I know. Because like you said in the opening remarks, a ventilation of free expression, and I know I have a God-given right under the Constitution of Dominica. They can say, go to hell with the Constitution, but I know it stands. That I have a God-given right for free expression. And I want to thank you, doctor, for laying to rest a political agenda, unknowing to them that they are shooting their very leader, which they so call and they say that he's one of their best leaders. But he didn't have a degree also, and that was Oliver Leblanc. And they are trying their best now to destroy a God-given man sent by God. After they asked him for how many years to come in the political arena. Now he's there. They are trying his best to pull him down and say he doesn't have a degree. But where is Oliver Leblanc? Did he have a degree to do all what he did? He didn't. But they're trying their best to pull down Mr. Leonard Lincoln about the degree. I mean, this is a myopic view, and these guys don't understand that. It simply shows that they have no capacity to think. Because one of their people that they hold up,
thank you,
Mr. Oliver Leblanc. I can't take all the night, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I give you, as I told you, give my regards.
I will.
Blessing.
Yes, sir. Good night, sir. Give him a hearing.
It's good to be present in such a high-powered environment. I really want to congratulate you for your lecture tonight. I feel very proud of you, being my teacher in 1970 at St. Mary's Academy.
Do you have to make everybody know how old I
am? A couple of things also. I read this book by Irving Andre, and I was very captivated by getting up every 2 years to read. And I would
like you to ensure that all your books are available at G, because I came looking for, after reading this one, I came looking for some others which I couldn't find. So I can look into that to ensure that all your books are available at the bookstore. Anyway, but my question is, usually after the death of a man, we tend to see the true metal, man or woman, of the person.
Right.
Because when I read your book, I realized the level of opposition that he will even face in his, during his political career. And so it seems that when a man has passed away, then we tend to look at and focus on the things that made him great.
Right.
Now, you mentioned a couple, I mean, we can learn from the successes of a man, but we can also learn from his failures.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned, in your lecture, you mentioned about the Rotterdam City Council matter, you mentioned about
right.
the Seditious Act,
right.
And you mentioned, I think, one of the other things. But what do you think was the major failure? I don't use that word in quotes, I'm very cautious. What do you think was the major failure, shortcoming of the leader in your research about it? What do you think was his major mistake that we can learn from his major failure? Was there any?
Well, everybody has failings. Leblanc was not a perfect individual. Bear in mind that one of the accusations leveled at him was that he had a chip on his shoulder. Well, I don't know about that chip. I mean, let's face it, Leblanc was trying to effect social change. And to the extent that he was trying to do so, then that, in my view, does not equate any suggestion that he had a chip on his shoulder. But I think, quite frankly, that if there was a shortcoming, it is because he became, especially in the final years, very disillusioned at the opposition, not the official opposition, at the lack of loyalty, for example, because you know that there was significant internal, it's not so much the opposition, was the problem, it's the internal difficulties that he faced. He tried to groom a successor, and he felt that successor, quite frankly, was not behaving in a fashion that was consistent with the goals of his organization and so on. There was, as you know, in the 70s, in 1970, what happened with the three ministers. And I think, quite frankly, that Mr. Leblanc, unfortunately, at one point, he felt that he had been pushed into a corner, politically speaking. He felt that there were very few people he could trust. If you read that last speech, there's significant bitterness in that speech. So that was a reflection of how he felt at the time. He felt that, in fact, at one point he lamented that he tried to groom certain individuals, but that didn't work. And I think perhaps he could have been a little more patient with the process of building, or looking beyond the immediate cadre of leaders and so on. But we can look at that in hindsight. And you know what they say about hindsight, to be quite frank with you. But let's face it, if he had no interest in perpetuating himself in power, then surely the last thing he would have done was to try to forge on and so on. And as I said, he left with his values intact. Because there's no doubt that he didn't leave because his popularity was waning. There might be a difference of opinion about that, to be quite frank with you. But Leblanc was very much on top of his political game. And no one would argue, at least seriously, that he faced defeat in Vacaz or wherever he chose to run on the next occasion. I mean, let's face it, he fired three ministers, and instead of proroguing the parliament as is happening in St. Kitts, he decided to have an election right there and then, in the face of what appeared to have been imminent defeat. And yet he prevailed. And he prevailed despite the fact that he had to form his own Leblanc Labour Party, and despite the fact that he had to toil, politically speaking, under his own symbol. So whereas those who had sought to move in a different direction fought the elections with the traditional symbol of the Labour Party, and presumably with the goodwill, Leblanc succeeded and defeated them in a significant and decisive fashion. What does that tell us about the man? And yet he walked away from it all so that he can go to fish at Otru. He can enjoy the quietude of his grandchildren. He can look at television, and we're not talking about Young and Restless. It's a nice program, but that's not what we're talking about. Do a little farming. He went back to his roots. What kind of man was this? You tell me. Hmm?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Linton.
Thank you very much. Dr. Andre, thank you very much. You were not just lucid, educational, and enlightening, you were also very inspirational. I want to thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
My brother who lives in New York listened to you on the radio this morning, and he called me about 4 o'clock this afternoon to make sure that I was going to listen to you tonight, and to say to me that he wanted me on his behalf to purchase 21 copies of your book on the Leblanc, and to pass them to some people that I'm working with right now that I know very well, who need to read them before the next election.
Mr. Linton, I know not of what you speak, but continue.
I knew Edward Oliver Leblanc because he's a very good friend of my father. And there were times when I had to drive my father and mother down to see the family in Vegas. What struck me was how quickly and decisively Edward Oliver Leblanc disconnected from the political life of Dominica. Almost as if he was disappointed that there was no succession plan for the kind of leadership he represented, and was willing to see keep going in the Labour Party. And I wanted your thoughts on that, as well as whether you stumble on any antidotes that he may have engaged against the corrupting influence of power, not at the end, but while he was involved in the exercise of power. Finally, I would like, in the company of all of these people here tonight, all of these wonderful Dominicans, to seek your permission to use the phrase moral malnutrition as I seek to continue a very important engagement that we're involved in right now.
I will have to look at. I will have to look at my speaking notes. Sorry. Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Isidore. The last speaker. Okay, it's up to you. You're the boss. Okay, let him ask a question. That's okay. Ask the question, Mr. Isidore.
Thank you for your indulgence. The last comment is very interesting because I want to thank you for having the formation of the consciences of the politicians in the country, and for those of us who aspire to higher office in the country. My Lord Bishop will tell you, I often, when I run into remind him of the need for the formation of my conscience and the consciences of those of us who aspire to leadership in the country. And I'm wondering, to what extent did Leblanc foster the institutional development of his party such that his values, his principles, and what he stands for could continue, because they seem to have been a little lapsed.
Yeah, the question is, what efforts did Leblanc make to ensure that his legacy, at least his moral legacy, lives on? And look, you can lead by example, and I think he tried to lead by example. That type of life, that type of monastic life, that life of self-imposed deprivation, that life of ensuring that that he's above reproach, he led by example. And the biggest teacher tried to lead by example. but there was one guy called Jesus or Judas, whatever his name is, Iscariot, and others who didn't follow the example. So look, I mean, there are limitations to just how much you can achieve. He tried to lead by example. He took certain actions. He was offered certain concessions. He did not accept or use them and rely on them. And what else could he have done? We can debate for the whole night long why it was that they were a breakaway faction in the Labour Party in the 1970s. I have my views. There are certain persons who obviously tried to usurp his leadership, and they did so to their detriment, because the Dominican people were the harshest arbiters, and they were the final judges of that political development. So we try to lead by example, and we try to ensure that as many persons as possible follow that example that we've set. And no one, quite frankly, is above change for the better. We're talking about the human spirit. And as I said earlier on, let us face it, one of Christ's followers was saved right on the road to Damascus. And I'm not speaking as a born-again whatever. But I personally think there's hope for us all. And I think there's hope for Dominica. There has to be. How can there not be hope for Dominica? Are you kidding me? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for your questions and that lively discussion. Before I call on Ms. Natasha Gervais, I'd just like to remind you that after she's finished with the vote of thanks, we'd like His Excellency and Mrs. Savre to leave first, and then you can leave. I now invite Ms. Natasha Gervais, who is the president of the UE Open Campus Guild of Students for the Dominica chapter. Is Natasha? Oh, yes. To do the vote of thanks for us.
His Excellency, the President, Mr. Charles A. Savre and Mrs. Savre, Reverend Gabriel Malzer, Bishop of Roseau, Justice Dr. Irving Andre, Superior Court of Justice, Ontario, Canada, and tonight's presenter, Dr. Francis Sevre, Director of the Open Campus Countrysides, Ms. Kimon Joseph, Officer in Charge, UE Open Campus, Ms. Jacinta David, Acting Chief Cultural Officer, members of the Leblanc family, staff of the Cultural Division and the UE Open Campus Dominica, students, alumni and friends of the UE Open Campus. We wish to thank their excellencies for their presence at this lecture this evening. We are pleased that so far they have been able to attend all of the functions of the UE Open Campus since last September. It is our pleasure to have the two of you among us, and we hope that you'll always be available and able to join us. We thank Justice Dr. Irving Andre for accepting our invitation to present this third annual UE Open Campus and Cultural Division EO Leblanc Memorial Lecture. Your presentation this evening was very enlightening, and your explanations of the person that Mr. Leblanc was and the type of policies that he implemented has truly shown us why he has earned his place among the distinguished leaders of our region. Special gratitude is conveyed to the Cultural Division for its willingness to continue the collaboration with the UE Open Campus Dominica site and for the inclusion of this event on the national calendar of events for independence. We hope that this relationship that has been established between our two institutions will continue well into the future. Thanks to our Bishop, Gabriel Malzer, who said the opening prayers, and we also thank you for your presence this evening. We are ever grateful to the Fort Young Hotel, who for the past 2 academic years has been offering our open campus site free use of this conference room to host all of our lecture series. We thank the Fort Young staff who worked diligently in preparing the space for our use. Our thanks must also be conveyed to the staff of the media institutions who have disseminated information about the lectures and who will use aspects of this evening's proceedings as news items for the week. We also thank Carry FM and Q95 for live coverage of the event. A special thanks to you, Dr. Pascal, for sponsoring the Q95 live broadcast. Lastly, but certainly not least, we thank you, the audience, for your participation in this lecture this evening. You are made up of our alumni, our students and friends, and some of you are faithful attendees of our lectures, panel discussions, film showings, and other programs, and you always encourage us to keep the educational events alive in our society. We wish everyone a safe journey home this evening. We hope to see you at our next lecture, which will be the 9th Annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial on November 27, 2014, right here at the Fort Young Hotel. There, Professor Brian Meeks, Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at the UWI Mona, will present the topic, Beyond the End of Sovereignty, Recapturing Space for Humanity in the Caribbean. Thank you very much for attending, and do have a good evening.